All right, we're ready to go. Good evening, welcome. Thanks for all of you coming out on a Tuesday night on a beautiful day in June for our 12th lecture. We've done 12. We have now lapped the year. We started a year ago, and we are going to continue. So tonight's topic is Charles the Great, because we have done Alexander the Great and Herod the Great. So tonight we're doing Charles the Great, aka Charlemagne, 768 to 814 AD. But because this video is going to be recorded and watched, I'll give a little introduction. Those of you who've been here before know all of this. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, founded in 2004, and our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. It is named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer. And in addition to these lectures, we also offer a high school program that is built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. We begin with the ancient world in 9th grade and finish with the 20th century in 12th grade. I know 20th century is now, we're going to have to update that. We're a quarter of the way through the 21st, so we may have to adjust the curriculum just a little bit. There's some pictures of the students that we've had over the years. We put on plays, we go on field trips. That's to the Stanza Raffaello and the Vatican Museum in Rome. And we have graduation exercises. And I'm Rob Shearer. I have been married for 47 years. My wife and I have raised 12 children. We currently have 21 grandchildren. I got my undergraduate degree at Davidson College in North Carolina and a master's from Stanford University on the left coast. I've been a historian, teacher, and author all of my life. I was a college professor for a little while, formerly the city manager here in Mount Juliet. That was an interesting chapter. We have a little publishing company, and with my wife, I'm co-director of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. So, I'll start off with my question. What's one thing you already know about Charlemagne?
The way he divided up his territory among his sons is one of the big historical mistakes of the early Egypt world.
Yeah, his empire did not last. It was very rapidly divided. Actually, it wasn't. He did have a single son who ruled, but then his 3 grandsons split it into 3 parts. So yeah, we'll talk about that. Anything else? Everybody calls him Charlemagne, which is the French version of his name. The French claim him, but his capital city, you will read in the Western Civ textbooks that he had his capital in a city named Aix-la-Chapelle. And then you will pull out an atlas of Europe and start looking for that location, and it's not on the map because Aix-la-Chapelle is the name the French applied to it, but the Germans have a different name for that same city. In German, it's Aachen, and it is, in fact, in Germany. So the French claim him, but he's probably got more in common with his German descendants than he does with his French descendants. And the language that he spoke would have been something closer to German and Anglo-Saxon than to modern French. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then I'm a root stretcher, so I'm going to have to get the setup done before we start talking about him. And the big question, of course, is how did we get from the Roman Empire, which we were talking about last month when we did Herod, and he's much more politically connected to Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Caesar Augustus than I think anybody is aware of. I learned a lot about it that I didn't know previously. You don't think of Herod as being a political figure playing with the bigwigs of the Roman Empire, but he was. So the question is, how do we get from the Roman Empire to the kingdom of the Franks? We're talking about the 700s when Charlemagne is born, and the short answer is the Roman Empire declined and fell. Of course, I want to give you a little bit longer answer. The last Roman emperor was deposed by an Ostrogothic king, the king of a tribe of Germans who had invaded in 476. And the king of the Ostrogoths, the king of the Goths, Odoacer, didn't want the title. He was content to be king of the Goths, thank you very much, or king of Italy. And so the last Roman emperor actually was packed off into retirement. They didn't kill him. He let him go retire to a villa in the countryside. He was king of the Goths, and he took the title king of Italy. He did not care to be the emperor because he really didn't want to antagonize the emperor in Constantinople. And if he took the title emperor, the emperor in Constantinople might take it as an attack, a rivalry, something he hadn't been approved of. So, Theodosius, Roman emperor, had made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And within a generation, the Visigoths sack Rome. We get St. Augustine of Hippo. I've done a lecture on him. I think it's on the YouTube channel. We get Boethius. I probably should do a lecture on him, who immediately follows. Just talked about Theodoric. Oh, no, I talked about Odoacer. Theodoric is the successor king of Italy. Theodoric defeats Odoacer, murders him, and takes the title, because that's what Germanic kings do. 520, St. Benedict heads for the hills from Rome because it's a wild, dangerous, wicked, corrupt place. It's full of Germanic kings and warriors, and the population is declining, and he says this is no place for a Christian. So he founds a monastic community out in the countryside. The Church of Hagia Sophia is built in Constantinople about 500. Pope Gregory I, who was in fact a Benedictine monk, who helped to found several Benedictine monasteries in the city. And 630, Muhammad enters Mecca with an army in triumph. We're still 100 years before we get to the Franks. And 711, the Muslims conquer Spain. Within 80 years of Muhammad triumphing in Mecca. Give a little more context. Now we're into the 8th century, the 700s. The very beginning of the century, a very important figure in the history of the English church, the Venerable Bede, who wrote a history of the English church. He's in Northumbria. He dies in 735. Interestingly, Beowulf is probably composed after his death. So the kingdom of Northumbria, they would have been speaking Anglo-Saxon, not anything like English. Beowulf is written in Old English, Anglo-Saxon. Pepin the Short, who is Charlemagne's father, was anointed king of the Franks by the Pope in 751. So when we're talking about Charlemagne's family, we're talking about the age of Beowulf. Charlemagne himself is born in 748. He becomes king of the Franks in 768 when his father Pepin dies. So he's 20 years old when he becomes king. He is crowned emperor in 800 AD. It's a nice round number, easy to remember. He's 52 years old at that point and already been ruling as king of the Franks for 32 years, and now he's emperor. He rules for another 14 years, dies in 814, and his rule begins what historians have called the Carolingian Renaissance. It's kind of a mini Renaissance. There had been dark ages before. There are some dark ages after. Charlemagne is like a bright, shining beacon in the midst of some terrible centuries. Beginning in 850, the Carolingian Empire disintegrates. We go back to dark ages, and it doesn't reemerge really until about 1100 then. 871, 899, Alfred the Great of England, who knows about Charlemagne, has read his biography, tries to imitate him in some ways. But of course, he's facing the Vikings, who have become a real threat. And one of the reasons why the period between 800 and 1100 is so dismal. This is a very complicated map, but all of the arrows are basically bad times. every arrow represents an invading Germanic tribe. It's just a wave. And you see the table up there in the upper right-hand corner. The Visigoths, the Visigoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns. I mean, it's like they can't catch a break. So all of those arrows show essentially the area that's in white is what had been the Roman Empire. And every piece, every inch of its territory is being plundered and settled. And these Germanic tribes are not trying to annex the Roman Empire to their existing kingdom over here somewhere on the north shore of the Black Sea. They are, in fact, refugees themselves. They are fleeing from the Huns. So they're on the move. They're basically an armed, homeless army. They're looking for a new place to settle. So you get a Vandal kingdom in North Africa, a Visigothic kingdom in Spain, and you get the Franks in the old Roman province of Gaul in the north. So we'll talk about that. That's how we did it. Here's a little more simplified. So here's the Ostrogoths. This is Odoacer. And you see they're originally from what would be now the Ukraine, along the Dnieper River and Crimea. And they're fleeing the Huns, and they wind up conquering Italy. The Visigoths actually start up there as well. Visi and Ostro is just Latin. They didn't call themselves that. Visi is west, and Ostro is east. So it's from the west bank of the Dnieper River and the east bank. They're the East Goths and the West Goths. So the Visigoths settle for a while in Macedonia. Alexander would be appalled. They actually sack Athens. And then they migrate because they hear there's gold in Rome. They sack Rome. Their king dies, so they head back out of Italy, sack part of southern Gaul, cross the Pyrenees. They establish a kingdom in the old Roman province of Hispania. And the Vandals come shortly thereafter, rampaging through. They fight the Visigoths for a while and then say, well, okay, we'll move on. And they actually set up a kingdom in North Africa that lasts for 2 centuries. A Germanic tribe from the northern shores of the Black Sea now has a kingdom on the north shore of Africa. And then there are the Huns. They just, I mean, yeah. Thugs on horseback. If they settle anywhere, it's sort of in the steppes of Hungary in here, but they are the ones who have driven those Germanic tribes out. And so here's the situation by about 500 AD. The Ostrogoths have taken Italy. The Visigoths have taken southern Gaul. This is a group sometimes called the Seubi or the Suevi. The Vandals. There's still a Roman Empire over here in the east with a capital in Constantinople, but it's shrunk to just those eastern provinces. And there we have the Franks. They came from northern Central Europe, probably not the Black Sea, but from the southern shores of the Baltic, and have migrated in and established their own territory because it was safer and richer than where they came from. And here's their kingdom. This is the territory they controlled in 481. Austrasia, you see there are some modern names on there as well, and modern cities. It's a little misleading because most of the modern cities didn't exist. Paris is at best a village on the bank of the river there. It's not where the Franks set up their capital. Here's Aachen. Aachen and Cologne, this is the Rhine River up here. So it's the lower reaches of the Rhine River, and this is the Main River here heading off to the east. Frankfurt would be about there. Frankfurt, the Franks' ford over the River Main. Fulda, Metz. Yeah, so that would have been the kingdom of the Franks in 481. Then they get a very successful unifying king named Clovis, a warrior king, young man who's very able in battle, and leads them to expand and conquer. He really triples the size of the territory they control. Swabia, what they call Neustria, and Aquitaine, all the way down into southern France. That would be by about 511. His successors add Burgundy and Gascony to the territory that's controlled. That's by about 614. And then this would be Charlemagne's grandfather and father, who add Septimania, Frisia, Thuringia, and then Charlemagne himself. Saxony, Bavaria, Carinthia, and the Lombard Kingdom of northern Italy. And a strip of land across the Pyrenees in Spain. It's the Spanish March. Charlemagne conquered, annexed, and then ruled that, including Barcelona, which is why the language in Barcelona is not Spanish. It's Catalan. So this territory, of course, is France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium. Yeah, it's a huge territory, but its capital, here we go, Aachen. It is on the west bank of the Rhine, but it's territory that is, to this day, part of West Germany, part of Germany now. And we need to say a word about the Arabs. We talked about the Huns. We talked a little bit, mentioned the Vikings, the Arabs. Here's Mecca. Here are the conquests of Muhammad's armies within a generation of his death. They conquered the Persian Empire, if you remember from Alexander the Great. They're up into the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and all of Persia. It's the first major conquest of the Arabs as they come out of the Arabian Peninsula. And then they hit the Mediterranean and spread out. And by 750, from 636 to 751, Saudi Arabia is just off that map there. They have conquered Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria. They wipe out the Vandals. That's what happened to their kingdom. They cross the Straits of Gibraltar. They wipe out the Visigoths. They actually cross the Pyrenees, and you see this little arrow here that then does a U-turn just south of Poitiers and Tours. There's the Battle of Tours in 717, won by the Franks, won by Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. Charles Martel is Charlemagne's grandfather. And you see the Lombards hanging on to Italy and the Byzantine Empire doing its best. You see these green arrows here. There are two invasions, two serious attempts to take Constantinople in that 120 years after Muhammad's death. They once come by land and besiege Constantinople. Constantinople's walls defend it, and they withstand the siege. They come with a fleet, and Constantinople's secret weapon of Greek fire defeats the galleys of the Arabs. And so the Byzantine Empire has managed to preserve its independence, and they claim all of this, but they're in a dispute with the Lombards. They do rule Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and what were the old territories of the Greek Empire. So that's how we got from the Roman Empire to the kingdom of the Franks. And here again, we're back. Charlemagne becomes king in 768. He actually rules 46 years. He is the king of the Franks. And for the last 14 years of that, he's also the emperor. There's a revival of that title, and I'll talk a bit about how that happens. And that's his kingdom. Everything from Rome to Denmark, and everything down to the southwest to the Pyrenees and across in this little strip of territory in Spain is Charlemagne's empire. So in 2014, which was 1,200 years after his death, The city of Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, Charlemagne's capital, celebrated Charlemagne with a special exhibition. And I've got a quick 5-minute clip that I think gives you a bit of a flavor of what it's like. And it is in English. You'll be happy to know, although you'll hear some people speaking German. Okay, let's see how we'll roll that.
Charlemagne, King of the Franks, Emperor in Western Europe. In Aachen, he's everywhere. Charlemagne in gold, in stone, as a marionette, as a coin, as gingerbread. Aachen is always popular with tourists. The old town is small and comfortably slow-paced, with its secluded squares and many fountains. But now, in the anniversary year of Charlemagne's death, special exhibitions are an extra attraction. Valuable exhibit items come from London and Paris, the Vatican, Austria and the Netherlands. Miraculously, they've survived for 1,200 years to tell their stories today. Like the Tassilo chalice. It was commissioned by the Bavarian Duke Tassilo on the occasion of his marriage to the daughter of a Lombard king. For Charlemagne, it was a clear breach of loyalty. The Lombards were his enemies, so he lured Tassilo into a trap and condemned him to death.
He also wanted to show royal clemency and had the death sentence commuted to lifelong confinement in a monastery. Tassilo and his entire family were divided among various cloisters in the Frankish realm.
And with that, Charlemagne simply wiped out Tassilo's family. There were no descendants. In contrast, his own family flourished. Charlemagne married 5 times, had many mistresses, and at least 18 children. It's said that about 2% of Europeans can claim they're direct descendants of the emperor. Charlemagne and his folding throne were always traveling. That's how he reigned over the many peoples he'd conquered, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. He was king for 46 years, in only 2 of which he didn't go to war. His weapons were the secret of his success.
Charlemagne had an exceptionally powerful army for the time. The cavalry evolved as a special branch of the military that could be decisive in battle. His army was comparatively well equipped, complete with body armor. And the weapons the Frankish kingdom produced were prized because they were extremely hard and durable.
Even when the anniversary exhibitions close at the end of September, there'll still be plenty of Charlemagne in Aachen. There's the town hall, for example. Today, people marry in the same place the king once celebrated his feasts. You can trace Charlemagne's footsteps with or without a guided tour in Aachen. The imperial seal in the cobblestones points you to all the important places. They include the cathedral. Charlemagne had its foundation stone laid in the year 796. It was a huge structure for its time. In 1978, it became the first German monument to be listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Many German kings were crowned in this church. They went up the same steps Charlemagne had ascended. They sat on the same throne he'd sat on. It's still surprising in its simplicity. But for Charlemagne, the marble slabs had immense value. They came from Jerusalem, the cradle of Christianity. Books from the early Middle Ages are also of enduring value. Charlemagne assembled the most important scholars of his time at his court. Although he himself couldn't write, he reformed and unified calligraphy, introducing the script called Carolingian minuscule. Until then, there'd only been capital letters. Aachen's International Newspaper Museum shows how, under Charlemagne, lowercase letters as we know them today were introduced. Charles the Great liked it small, for good reason.
The widest variety of dialects was spoken. New languages surfaced, the beginnings of German and French, for example. And to standardize them, it was important to have a standardized system of writing.
Books have handed down the knowledge of feasting and dining at Charlemagne's court. The Aula Carolina regularly invites people to historical banquets. Even 1,200 years ago, music was part of them. There was fruit, vegetables, game, and plenty of beer and wine.
Banquets followed a strict ritual in which, of course, the emperor and his family ate first. And when the Emperor Charlemagne had put down his knife and belched loudly, then the lower ranks, the nobility, could begin. And so it continued down the hierarchy.
It's a good thing not all the traditions are still kept up today. But with pâté and fresh salad, we can still revel in a modern version of the good old days.
So, if you get to Germany, I urge you, put Aachen on the list. It's a great place to go. So let's talk about this guy, this 20-year-old king who's inherited a large empire and makes it even larger, whose grandfather had been a victorious warrior, defeated an invading Arab army. How do we know anything about him? And as it turns out, we're in a whole lot better shape with Charlemagne than we were with Alexander or even Herod. The sources are much closer. We, in fact, have a biography of Charlemagne that was written by someone who knew him. Einhard wrote a Vita Caroli Magni, Life of Charles the Great, written within probably 10 years, maybe 20 of his death. And he not only was a contemporary, he had been a member of the court. We don't know all the details of his life, but we know enough. He had entered a Benedictine monastery to be educated. He did not become a monk. The abbot of the monastery near Fulda sent him to Aachen because of his intellectual promise, and he became a tutor to Charlemagne's children. And then we don't really know for sure, but there is a legend in the German town where he settled after Charlemagne's death, and where he and his wife are buried. His wife was named Emma. The legend, which we can't find any documentary evidence to prove or disprove, the legend is that Emma was one of Charlemagne's daughters, and that they had eloped. And Charlemagne was initially furious, but eventually forgave him. And in his will, he actually made provision for Einhard to receive appointment as abbot of several different monasteries. And he's an abbot and married. And the town in Germany where he was abbot remembers him rather fondly. We also have Chronicles of the Kings of the Franks in Latin that cover the years of Charlemagne's father and Charlemagne and his son. So from 741 to 829, we have these Latin chronicles, which basically give you short entries, sometimes only a sentence or two, maybe a paragraph, for here are the important things that happened this year. It helps us to confirm some of the details in Einhard, because Einhard doesn't give us a standard chronological biography. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But what he gives us is extremely useful. We also have a one generation downstream biography by Notker, whose nickname is the Stammerer. And Notker writes in the 880s. He is a monk of the monastery of St. Gall, which is down on the border between Switzerland and Germany. And he writes for Charlemagne's grandson the deeds of Charles the Great. Yeah, it really should be Charles the Great, not Charlemagne, but okay, the French get one. We have some regional chronicles that record when Charlemagne is doing something in a particular area. There is some poetry, a few short poems written by some of the scholars who were at his court, Alcuin of York, who came across the channel, and Paul the Deacon. And then we have some archaeological details that confirm the cathedral in Aachen is still standing, that he started in 796, and his throne is there. In fact, there's a very famous incident when Napoleon in the early 1800s leads the armies of the French Republic out of France and conquers the Low Countries, and then begins conquering and marching through the Germanic territories. He visits Aachen, he visits the tomb of Charlemagne, and he climbs the steps of the throne and sits down in the marble throne. but it's in territory he's conquered from the Germans. All right. So here's the family tree. I've mentioned the grandfather, Charles Martel, his wife, Rotrude, his father, Pepin III, a.k.a. Pepin the Bref, or Pepin the Short. And his wife, Bertrada, they have two sons, Charles and Charlemagne. Pepin dies in 768, and these two sons divide the Frankish realm between the two of them. Charlemagne died 3 years after his father, which left Charlemagne then as the sole ruler. And from then on, he is at that point 23 years old. He is conducting a military campaign every year. So his grandparents and his parents. And here's Einhard. There's good English translation. And I'll talk just a little bit about the format. It's not very long. It's only about 50 or 60 pages in translation. It's written in Latin. And Einhard is a scholar. He's very well educated. And he takes advantage of the books that Charlemagne has collected in Aachen. He's familiar with the Roman authors. He's familiar with Roman history. In particular, he has read the Roman historical biographies of the 12 Caesars, Suetonius. And so he actually models his biography of Charlemagne on Suetonius's 12 Caesars biographies, making Charlemagne the 13th Caesar. It's almost cookie cutter in terms of following the outline that Suetonius used. And let me just read you, as I say, we've got a good English translation. I'm going to read you first a preface that was written by one of Einhard's successors at the monastery, someone who knew Einhard, did not know Charlemagne. This is Walafrid Strabo. He says, we have a manuscript from the 850s that has this preface in it. And he says, Einhard is known to have written the account of the life and deeds of the most glorious Emperor Charles, which follows. Among all the palace officials at that time, he was esteemed with great praise, not only for his knowledge, but also for the complete honesty of his way of life. Because he was present at most of the events, he attested them with the purest truth. He was born in eastern Francia, in a region called the Main-Gau. It's the valley of the Main River. He received the rudiments of his education as a boy at the monastery of Fulda, under a teacher of the martyr Saint Boniface. From there, he was sent to the palace of Charles by Baugulf, the abbot of the monastery, not so much because of the nobility, which was so clear in him, as because of his particular capacity and intelligence and the wisdom which later shone forth in him. Charles was the keenest of all kings to seek out and support wise men so that they might philosophize with all delight. Almost all of the kingdom entrusted to him by God was so foggy and almost blind, but he made it luminous with the new ray of knowledge, almost unknown to this barbarous land, with God lighting the way so it could see. But now, studies are growing weak, and the light of wisdom, because it is less loved, grows rarer among most people. So, even in the 9th century, even just one generation or two generations after Charlemagne, they're going, yeah, well, it's going downhill. So let me give you a bit. I talked about Suetonius as the model. Suetonius is a unique ancient author in that he is much more interested in the personal qualities of the Caesars than he is in giving a chronological history of their acts. And so Einhard follows that same pattern. And let me just read you his introduction. Remember, this is written by someone who was at the court for many years. We know he was a tutor to Charlemagne's children. He may have married Charlemagne's daughter. Here's Einhard's preface. After I decided to write about the life, character, and no small part of the accomplishments of my lord and foster father, Charles, that most excellent and deservedly most famous king, I determined to do so with as much brevity as I could. I took pains to omit none of the facts that have come to my notice, nor to irritate the minds of those who are critical by supplying at great length an account of everything new. If it is possible to avoid angering with a new work those who criticize the ancient monuments composed by the most learned and eloquent of men. And yet, I do not doubt that there are many people devoted to contemplation and learning who think that the circumstances of the present age should not be so neglected, that almost everything that happens now, not worthy of any memory, should be condemned to silence and oblivion. Some people are so led on by the love of lasting fame that they would rather insert the famous deeds of others into any sort of writings than remove the fame of their own name from the memory of posterity by writing nothing. But I did not see why I should refuse to undertake a composition of this sort, since I was aware that no one could write about these things more truthfully than I could. I was present and knew them by the witness of my own eyes, as they say. And I could not know clearly whether they would be written about by anyone else. I thought it would be better to write these things down, along with other things which are well known, for the memory of posterity, rather than to suffer the most famous life of this most excellent king, the greatest of all the men of his age, and his remarkable deeds, which men of our own time can barely imitate, to be swallowed up in the shadows of oblivion. There is still another not unreasonable impulse which would have sufficed on its own to compel me to write these things, namely the nurture he bestowed on me and the perpetual friendship with him and his children after I began living at his court. Through this he so bound me to him and put me in his debt, both in life and death, that I would rightly seem and be judged ungrateful if I forgot the many kindnesses he bestowed on me and passed over in silence the most famous and illustrious deeds of a man who had deserved the best from me. Nor could I allow his life to remain without written memorial and proper praise, as if he had never lived. But to write and set forth such a life would need not my little talent, which is poor and small and almost non-existent, but would tax the eloquence of a Cicero. So you can get a flavor of Einhard from that, I think, and his awareness of who he is and what he has lived through, and his quotation from Cicero in the preface is actually, I think, quite interesting. Let's see here. So I've already jumped on to Einhard's personal character. Did I miss a... Okay, so there's... Yeah, okay, so I asked Grok, show me Charlemagne and his children and Einhard. Grok. It's actually... That's not bad. I'll take it. All right. I won't give away what that picture is about. I'll read you a bit here first. Page 35. So I mentioned he tries to tell us the character of the man rather than a chronicle of the things that he did. So here's his description of Charlemagne's character. Moderate in his food and drink. He was more moderate when it came to drink, since he very much hated to see anyone drunk, especially himself and his own household. But he was not able to abstain from food, and often complained that fasting was bad for his health. He used to feast very rarely, and only on special holidays, but then with a large number of people. At his meal each day, only 4 courses were prepared, in addition to the roast, which the hunters were accustomed to serve on spits, and which was his favorite dish. While eating, he listened either to a performer, meaning a musician, or to someone reading out the histories and deeds of the ancients. He enjoyed the books of St. Augustine, especially those entitled The City of God. So he actually, didn't have books on tape or Spotify, but he had a monk to read out loud to them at mealtime. And he's reading Augustine's City of God. That just blows my mind. He was so restrained in his drinking of wine and any sort of drink that he rarely drank more than 3 times at a meal. In summer, after the midday meal, he would take some fruit and take a single drink. Then he would take off his clothes and shoes as if it were night and would rest for 2 or 3 hours. So Charlemagne took naps. I like it. At night, he slept so that he not only woke up, but also got up 4 or 5 times. While putting on his shoes and dressing, he not only saw friends, but if the count of the palace said that there was some dispute which could not be resolved without his judgment, he would order him to bring the disputants, and then, as if sitting in court, he heard the dispute and gave judgment. He not only did this at that time, but whatever on that day needed to be handled or whatever was to be requested of any of his officials was dealt with. He was rich in eloquence and was able to express most clearly whatever he wished to say. He was not simply content with his native tongue, but spent time learning foreign languages. Of these, he learned Latin well enough to pray in it as much as in his own native language. But he was able to understand Greek better than he could speak it. He was so fluent that he even seemed verbose. He cultivated the liberal arts most studiously, and greatly respecting those who taught them, he granted them great honors. In learning grammar, he followed Peter of Pisa, an elderly deacon. For the other disciplines, he had as his teacher Alcuin, called Albinus, a deacon from Britain of the race of the Saxons, a man who in any place would have been thought most learned. With him, he spent much time and effort learning rhetoric and dialectic, and especially astronomy. He learned the art of calculation, and with concentrated learning and precision, he investigated the movement of the stars. He tried to learn to write, and for this reason, he put tablets and notebooks under the pillows in his bed, so that if he had any free time, he could accustom his hand to forming letters. But his effort, begun too late, achieved little. So he's apparently able to speak multiple languages and to understand. It wouldn't have been French. It would have been Frankish would be the name for it, and it would have sounded like Anglo-Saxon, very close to Anglo-Saxon. Latin, Greek, and perhaps the dialects are already beginning to be spoken in Italy. With great piety and devotion, he practiced the Christian religion, in which he had been reared from infancy. For this reason, he constructed a church of great beauty at Aachen, and adorned it with gold and silver and lamps, and with railings and portals made of solid bronze. Since he could not procure columns and marble from anywhere else, he took the trouble to have them brought from Rome and Ravenna. As long as his health allowed, he regularly went to church, both morning and evening, and also to the night offices and to Mass. He was specially concerned that everything done in the church should be done with the greatest dignity, and frequently warned the sacristans that nothing foul or unclean should be brought into the church or left there. He supplied the church with such an abundance of sacred vessels made of gold and silver, and with such a great number of clerical vestments, that in the celebration of the Mass, not even the sextons, who hold the lowest of all the ecclesiastical orders, found it necessary to serve in their ordinary clothes. He corrected the discipline of reading and singing most carefully, for he was skilled in both. But he himself never read publicly and would only sing in a low voice with the rest of the congregation. You get a picture of what he was like? I'm going to switch to Notker now, because this is a great little anecdote he tells about his interest in education. Charlemagne founded schools. Probably not yet universities, but he founded schools to teach and train people for the priesthood, for church offices, and to serve as his administrators. And he has these teachers who have been attracted to his court. Alcuin from Northumberland is just one of a dozen or more. And so there's a hilarious anecdote that Notker tells, and Notker is writing this description for Charlemagne, one of Charlemagne's grandsons. Let's see here. This is on page 56. There we go. Yes. So he had an Irish monk who had come across from Ireland to Iona. Of course, the Irish monks had evangelized northern England, and who arrived at the court in Aachen and said he was looking to acquire more wisdom, and Charlemagne immediately appointed him as the teacher at one of the schools that he had founded. So when the most victorious Charles, this is Notker now, not Einhard, Notker, when the most victorious Charles, after a long time, returned to Gaul, he ordered the boys he had entrusted to Clement, the Irish monk that he'd made their teacher, to come to him and to offer him their letters and poems. Those of middling and low rank offered them sweetened with all the savors of wisdom, more than anyone could have hoped for. But the children of the nobles offered work full of all fatuity. Then the most wise Charles, imitating the justice of the eternal judge, placed those who had worked well on his right and said to them, "Many thanks, my sons. You have worked hard to carry out my order and to do what is useful to you as best you could. Now, strive to reach perfection. I will give you splendid bishoprics and monasteries, and you will always be honored in my sight." Then he turned to those on his left, the sons of the nobleman, with great hostility, twisting his face and pierced their consciences with his fiery gaze, and ironically, he thundered rather than spoke these dread words to them. "You nobles, you sons of my leading men, soft and dandified, trusting in your birth and your wealth, paying no attention to my command and to your advancement, you neglected the pursuit of learning and indulged yourselves in the sport of pleasure and idleness and foolish pastimes." When he had said this, turning his august head and his unconquered right hand to heaven, he thundered forth an oath. "By the King of the heavens, I think nothing of your nobility and your beauty. Others can admire you. Know this without any doubt, unless you rapidly make up for your idleness by eager effort, you will never receive any benefit from Karl Magnus." Yeah. So he is looking for sort of the first example we have in the medieval West of a meritocracy. He doesn't care what their lineage and inheritance is, what their ancestry is. He's going to examine the students and see who has shown diligence and promise and accomplishment. And that's Notker actually writing that story down for the benefit of Charlemagne's grandson. I'm going to skip over the fun story. There's a story about a monk who wandered into a church service who was from a very remote part where apparently they didn't use Gregorian chant or any other form of liturgical music, and he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but he tried. And Charlemagne, rather than embarrassing him, actually gave him a purse of gold and said, "Thank you for trying to sing." All right, so let me read this is a fun interchange between Alcuin of York and Charles. Let's see here, page 61. Yeah. Charles, seeing the study of letters flourishing throughout all his kingdom, but lamenting that it did not reach the ripeness of the earlier fathers, though he was striving more than was human, burst out in disgust. "Oh, if only I could have 12 clerics as learned as Jerome and Augustine were." To which the most learned Alcuin, rightly thinking himself most unlearned in comparison to those two, full of great anger, but scarcely showing it, dared to do what no other mortal would do in the sight of the dread Charles, replied, "The creator of heaven and earth did not have many like those men, and you want 12? He goes, "I want 12 teachers like Jerome and Augustine." Now he goes, "God didn't make that many. You want 12 of them?" Yeah. Tells you something interesting about both men. So there's his kingdom. We just talk a little bit. Oh, yes, we got to talk about it's being crowned by the Pope. So the Pope in Rome was actually attacked by the Lombards and almost killed. They threatened to blind him, and they did briefly scar with a sword his eyes. And he sent a message to Charles, the King of the Franks, and said, "Would you please come rescue me from the wicked Lombards who show no respect for my office as Bishop of Rome and head of the church?" So Charles did bring an army down. He defeated the Lombards in battle, came to Rome, and here's the account. As Charles stayed in Rome for a few days for the sake of the army, the bishop of the Apostolic See called together all who were able to come from the neighboring districts, and then, in their presence, and in the presence of all the counts of the unconquered Charles, he declared him to be the emperor and defender of the Roman Church. Charles had no guess of what was coming, and though he could not refuse what seemed to have been divinely preordained for him, nevertheless, he received his new title with no show of immediate thankfulness. First, he thought that the Greeks would be fired by greater envy than ever and would plan some harm against the kingdom of the Franks, or at least would take greater precautions against a possible sudden attack of Charles to subdue their kingdom and add it to his own empire. And further, the magnanimous Charles recalled how ambassadors from the king of Constantinople had come to him and had told him that their master wished to be his loyal friend, and that if they became nearer neighbors, he had determined to treat him as his son and relieve the poverty of Charles from his resources. And how upon hearing this, Charles had been unable to contain any longer the most fervent fire of his heart and had exclaimed, "Oh, would that the pool were not between us, for then we would either divide between us the wealth of the East, or we would hold it in common." Yeah. So the story that was told is that Charlemagne did not seek the title, and that in fact he was surprised. Actually, Einhard's account is it was Christmas Day, and there was a service in the Cathedral of St. Peter, and Charles attended, and the Pope snuck up on him and put the crown on his head. Whether that's a true account or not, it does seem that Charles was content to be king of the Franks. He'd already been king for 30 years. And so his receiving that title from the Pope, but then, of course, his descendants eagerly maintained all of that. Oh, and that's Grok again. I wish there'd been a camera there, but yeah. Oh, and his campaigns against the Saxons. The Saxons were a stubborn, rebellious tribe. He started campaigns against them for 30 years. He went to war almost every year with the Saxons. They were thorns in his side. They refused to be conquered. They were pagan. He defeated them in battle over and over again. They agreed to cease attacking the Franks, to cease raiding Frankish villages. They agreed at one point to give up their pagan gods and become Christians, and then recanted and went back. So, yeah. The war, the 30-year war, could have been ended faster if the faithlessness of the Saxons had allowed it. It is hard to say how often they were conquered and surrendered humbly to the king and promised they would do what was ordered, handed over the hostages demanded without delay, receive the envoys who were sent. Sometimes they were so broken and weakened that they even promised to abandon the worship of demons and submit to the Christian religion. But although at times they were ready to do this, they were always so quick to break their promises, so that it is not possible to judge which of these can be said to have come to them more easily. For after the start of the war against them, there was scarcely a year in which they did not make this sort of change. But the king's greatness of soul and perpetual firmness of mind, both in bad times and good, could not be conquered by their mutability or worn down by the task he had begun. He never allowed those who did anything of this sort to go unpunished, and he himself would avenge their treachery and demanded a fit punishment until everyone who was accustomed to resist was crushed and brought back under his control, either with an army he led himself or one sent by his counts. He moved 10,000 men who lived on both sides of the river Elbe with their wives and children and dispersed them throughout Gaul and Germany in many groups. But the war, which lasted so many years, ended on this condition imposed by the king and accepted by the Saxons, that they would reject the worship of demons and abandon their ancestral rites and would take up the Christian faith and sacraments and religion, and united with the Franks would form one people with them. It was a nice dream. It didn't last. So his expanded kingdom, eastward into Saxony, Bavaria, Carinthia, southward into northern Spain, that little Spanish march, southward into northern Italy, he annexed all of Lombardy, and it remained a part of the Holy Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages. There was no nation of Italy. That was a province of the Holy Roman Empire. And the emperors, the Germanic noblemen who inherited that title, continued to enact taxes and to insist that the cities of northern Italy owed them taxes. And they all went to Rome to be crowned emperor. That became the tradition of the Germanic emperors. They all went to Rome to be crowned emperor by the Pope. Emperor, there were probably 20 or 30 of them who eventually were all crowned emperor in Rome, which they considered to be part of their realm. Now, it was again and again in rebellion, but they considered it part of their realm. And so this unification of Europe politically, even though his kingdom fragments, does persist for centuries through the Middle Ages. His administrative reforms, he really did try and establish trained, competent governors to administer the different parts of his kingdom. He believed education was the key to doing that, and that was why he established the schools, not just to educate clergy, but to educate civil servants. There was a cultural revival. He founded schools, churches, and monasteries, funded them generously. There were religious reforms. He did not approve of an uneducated clergy. He wanted to see the clergy educated, trained, and able to celebrate the liturgical services with some care and attention to detail. And he formed a counterweight to both the Byzantine Empire in the east and the Caliphate further to the east, the Muslim world. He was in good relations with the Harun al-Rashid, who was the caliph in Baghdad. There's correspondence we actually have between them, and they exchanged gifts. At one point, Harun al-Rashid sent Charlemagne an elephant. And we can trace Charlemagne's travels through his realm because the local chronicles, I mentioned that some of them, record when they always mention when Charlemagne shows up with the elephant. It was a big deal. But his political kingdom did not last long. His three grandsons split it into West Francia, Lotharingia, and East Francia. Lotharingia was just too big to be administered and so broke up and was absorbed by East Francia, and that's eventually France and Germany. But both political entities are the descendants of Charlemagne's empire. And you see, it's very easy how we get from Francia to France. So what did he accomplish? Why is he great? Well, the Franks themselves had been converted by Clovis' wife. Charlemagne converts the Germans. The preaching of Boniface, of course, helped, but the conquest of Charlemagne is actually what brought them into the Christian world. And I have a huge debate with my students when we teach Charlemagne. Is Charlemagne's forced conversion of the Saxons legit? And were they really converted? It's 7:02. I'm done. Oh. We are going to continue. So this is the last lecture of the spring. It's still astronomically spring. Summer does not start for another 11 days. So we're going to have 3 summer lectures. And I'm going to do George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt. And their lives touch. Abraham Lincoln is, well, almost touch. Abraham Lincoln is actually born 10 years after Washington's death. But when he is born, Jefferson is president. So Lincoln really does touch the founding fathers. And Teddy Roosevelt is 7 years old when Lincoln dies. And we have a photograph, a Matthew Brady photograph of Lincoln's funeral cortege going through Manhattan. And Teddy Roosevelt and his brother are in the window watching Lincoln's funeral procession. So those 3, actually, you can do all the presidents of the United States, you can do the whole history of the United States in 4 presidents. Add Ronald Reagan, because Reagan is born before Teddy dies. So if you add Reagan to that list, you have the history of the United States in 4 presidents. So we'll come back next month, July 8th, just after the 4th. Talk about George Washington. I'll try and tell you some things about Washington that maybe aren't in the history textbooks. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Any questions about Charlemagne? More that you want to know? Yes.
Yes, I'm trying to. It was the person that his name began with an N. N-O-T-C-K.
N-O-T-K-E-R. Notker. Notker.
His nickname.
Yeah, the stammerer.
Thank you. How did he get that nickname?
Well, clearly, he could write fluently, but not talk.
Oh.
Yeah, he was known to be inarticulate and could not speak sentences with any fluency, but he could write. And the book that he wrote, again, was a collection of stories about Charlemagne that was dedicated and intended for the instruction of one of Charlemagne's grandsons, who was also a king. And it's basically, let me tell you some stuff about your grandfather, and you should try and imitate him. Anybody else? Question, comment, spark some interest? I always find it amusing that everybody, when they first think of Charlemagne, thinks of him as French. And he's not French. Probably not completely accurate to call him German, but he's more German than French, and his capital city is in Germany. Yes?
Did he ever go over into Ireland or up to Scotland at all?
No. He attracted scholars from those kingdoms. Alcuin is from York, and there are records in the biographies of some of the Irish monks who, because the Irish saved civilization, they had preserved a lot of the learning, the hand-copied books from the ancient world. And so several of the Irish monks heard about Charlemagne and made their way to Aachen and became part of his court. And he appointed them to teach in schools that he was founding. But he never crossed the channel. All right. Thanks for coming. Hope you'll come back next month. We'll talk about George Washington.